All right, so welcome to Chapter 6, Consumer Choices. And so the book talks about how during the Great Financial Collapse, the consumption of food and a lot of other goods decreased, right? And, what increased during that period is kind of the driving question that the book asks, right? During this period of declining economic activity, right? So during 2008 crisis, right? What did consumers increase their spending or consumption on? Right? So we know it wasn't food. Food decreased by 10%. Clothing and travel and everything like that decreased as well, right? So how do consumers decide what they're spending, right? Ultimately, consumers have a very diverse set of tastes and preferences, right? It would be a very boring world if we all liked the same exact type of jeans, if we all liked the same t-shirts, if we liked the same type of coffee and hats and computer, you know what I mean? So it's the variety, to be trite is the spice of life, right? And so we want to talk about how consumers make their choices, and a big part of that is just their tastes and preferences, right? There's just no accounting for taste, right? You can't argue about something, about taste, right? It's just what somebody likes. It's the aesthetics of it or whatever the case may be. So when we're talking about consumer choices and we're talking about, tastes and kind of the decision making, right? What is economics at the end of the day? It's about making decisions in situations of scarcity, right? We have unlimited needs and wants, but we only have a limited amount of stuff. And when we're talking about consumers and a limited amount of stuff, we're going to be talking specifically about a budget constraint. And so a budget constraint is in a very simplified world, right? It's in a too-good world. So again, all economics models are toy models, right? We obviously consume more than 2 goods in our lifetime, in a day, sometimes in an hour, right? But for this, situation, it's difficult for us to think in many different dimensions, right? We're used to thinking in just X and Y, in just 2 different dimensions. So that's part of the reason why we're simplifying it, because, our brains can only really conceive 3-dimensional modeling, right? 4-dimension and beyond is just beyond our comprehension. So that's part of the reason why we do it, is just so that we can actually have a visual representation that makes some sense. So a budget constraint is in a too-good world, and it is showing me my different combinations of the 2 goods or services. The book uses goods, and a lot of books and textbooks and just websites do this all the time. They say goods. They really mean goods and services. Like essentially, the "and services" is tacit, right? It's implicit. I'm just gonna keep it in there just because I like that abbreviation, GNS, right? Goods and services. But again, I'm not. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't have any qualms with the book. It's just the fact that just as a convention, economists writ large just talk about goods rather than goods and services when they really are talking about goods and services. So it's a possible combination of 2 goods or services, and this is the important part, right? That's affordable. So it's affordable at that consumer's income. So again, what is our demand, right? Our demand is not just the willingness to buy something, right? I could have the willingness to buy something all day long. If I don't have the cash or the credit, I'm not going to be able to buy it, right? So it's the willingness and ability to buy. So this is the ability kind of part, right? The affordable. And when we're talking about consumer choices and budget constraints, another important definition for us to have in here is talking about this completely made up concept of utility. and specifically total utility. And so total utility is going to be my, and again, it's kind of my total satisfaction, right? My overall satisfaction that I derive, that I get from being a consumer and choosing stuff. Now, economics, for the most part, is not about looking at things and analyzing things in their totality. Economics is about looking at things and analyzing things on the what's called the margin. So when we look at the marginal utility, the marginal utility is simply the additional utility provided by consuming one more unit. So, of course, we've got some equations here, right? Our marginal utility relates to our total utility in that it is the change, so it's that delta symbol for change in my total utility, and I'll expand this in a second here, over my change in my, I guess I should kind of do different colors here, change in my quantity. And so this we can also think of as my Q2 minus, let's do it down here. So this would be Q2 minus Q1 and this is going to be TU2 minus TU1. So our marginal utility is nothing more than the change in our total utility that is normalized by 1 unit of consumption. So I want to warn you right now, a lot of times when we are doing this kind of analysis, you will have something that, try to find, it's always hard to find the right color. Like this one's probably not going to show up. Usually the quantities, oh, that's okay. So the quantity and then the total utility or whatever. It wouldn't be like that. It would probably just say quantity and then utility. So for the most part, you will see a lot of stuff that's like, okay, at 0, I have 0 utility. At 1, I get, 30 utility. At 2, my utility increases to, 50 or whatever the case may be, right? So again, don't pay attention so much to this part. We'll get to that part. Most of the time, you're going to have the quantity increasing incrementally, right? Increasing by 1. That will not always be the case, right? It's perfectly legal for me or the book to have this be in 5s or 10s or something like that, right? And so again, if it's not, if the quantity is by any sort of units other than 1, you have to really remember this denominator here. So you're going to get used to doing something like this, right? So if it's 1, 2, and this is 30, and this is 50, what would my marginal utility for my first one be? Well, it doesn't exist for 0, but the marginal utility for the first one is going to be 30 minus 0 over 1 minus 0, right? So it's going to be 30. My marginal utility for the second one is going to be 50 minus 30 over 2 minus 1, so that's going to be 20. So my marginal utility is how much extra utility am I getting by doing that second thing? Does that make sense to everybody? Calculating the marginal utility when it increases by 1. So while that makes sense, what if we did it by 5? So now our marginal utility, again, for 0 doesn't exist. For the first one, it's going to be 30 minus 0 over 5 minus 0. So this is going to give me a very different marginal utility of 6. Because why? Because my marginal utility is defined as normalized to 1 unit. So we cannot forget this denominator part. Again, you're going to get in the habit of, oh, things increase by 1, so it's really easy for me to figure out the marginal utility, and then the quantity is going to change, and the quantity is going to start to go up by 5s or 10s or hundreds or whatever, right? So just keep that in mind, that this definition is not just the numerator, despite the fact that a lot of times when you're doing these exercises, all you really will be doing is the numerator, because the denominator is going to be 1 for the most part in the way that all of this stuff is presented to us. Does that make sense to everyone? So I just want to kind of warn you of that right now while we're learning about it. Awesome. Okay, so our next thing to talk about is, and this is actually, let's keep with this example because the example I think is helpful. So for the most part, the way in which production happens, and again, this is in the short run, right? We talked last time about the difference between the short run and the long run, how in the short run, something is fixed, right? So it's maybe the land, the building, it might be the number of espresso machines you have, it might be the number of pizza ovens you have, it might be the size of your freezer for ice cream, or whatever the case may be, right? There's something that is fixed. And so when you add, oh, so that's the production side of it. So this is the consumption side, sorry. So consumption side of it, our first, when we're really hungry, the first piece of pizza tastes really good, right? The utility that we get from it is 30. So we get an extra 30 utils from that first piece of pizza. When we eat the second piece of pizza, right, we're not full from the first piece of pizza. So eating the second piece of pizza increases our total utility to 50, right? But that second piece of pizza, because we weren't hungry, we weren't as hungry, is going to give us less in terms of that particular slice of pizza, right? So the first pizza gave us 30 utils, and the second pizza gave us 20. And again, this is a made-up thing and a made-up units, but it does have a unit, and it's called a util. And so what we find over time is we find that this is decreasing, right? The marginal utility is getting lower and lower and lower. And so that is a law in economics of diminishing marginal utility. So the diminishing marginal utility is a common pattern that each marginal unit of a good is going to provide less. And then here's the important part, of an addition. So it's still going to be an addition. It's just going to not be as large, right? So it's not that the second piece of pizza took away any of our utility or our satisfaction. It still increased our utility. There was still an addition, but it was less than the first addition, right? 20 is less than 30 of an addition to utility than the previous unit. So when we're talking about these kind of things, we are really talking about consumers and budget lines. So let's go ahead and get into what that looks like right now. So on this axis, we're going to have movies. And on this axis, we're going to have t-shirts. And given our income, we know that if we maxed out and just bought t-shirts, we could have 4 t-shirts and 0 movie tickets. If we maxed out and bought only movie tickets, we would have 8 movie tickets and 0 t-shirts. And then we have every combination in between, at least every discrete combination, right? You can't own half of a t-shirt, and you can't go to half of a movie. Does that make sense, everybody? And from this graph, what can you infer about the price of movies and the price of t-shirts? Very good. T-shirts are twice as expensive as movies. And if I told you that movies cost $7, you would be able to figure out what the total income of this person is, right? The book says this is Jose's budget schedule. So if we're told that movies are at $7 each, then we take that y-intercept, we take the intercept of whatever that thing is that we're given the price, and we multiply it by the price to get the total budget, right? So we would go 8 times $7 each equals $56. That's his total budget. That's his budget income. So these points tell us all the different combinations that Jose can get of movies and t-shirts that are affordable. Does that make sense to everyone? When we're doing this kind of calculation, what we want to actually break things down to is we want to break things down to the marginal utility per dollar. And so this is really just equal to the marginal utility divided by whatever the price is. And so we are told that there is a utility, a maximizing utility rule. Where in order to maximize my total overall utility, which is what I'm trying to do, right? My utility maximizing choice, so to maximize total utility, I should consume the combination of goods such that the marginal utility per dollar spent is the same for both goods. So this would be mu1 over p1 is equal to mu2 over p2. Gazoon time. Now, how are consumer choices impacted? Knowing that this is how consumers are going to behave, how are they actually impacted, right? So we're going to use our budget graph, our budget line, and talk about a new situation where we're going to have our income increasing. And we're in a too good world of concert tickets and overnight stays. So we start off with this budget line here. We can either spend all of our budget on tickets and we can get 20 of them, or we can spend all of our budget on stays and get 5 of them. We are told, though, given the marginal utility and the price of them, that the consumers are going to be staying 3 nights and purchasing 8 tickets. So this is our utility maximizing choice, M. And we're asked, what happens if income increases? If income increases, this whole line shifts outward in a parallel fashion. So now we are at a new budget line where we can get 40 tickets or 10 overnight stays. Our income has doubled. Now, what if both of these goods were normal goods? If both of these goods are normal goods, what does that mean for the consumption of them as income increases? Person who's on their phone and their laptop the whole time. What does that mean for the consumption increases? Okay.
Would they just stay stable?
Hmm?
Would they just stay stable?
No, they would increase, right? Increase of income is going to increase your demand, right? So if they're normal goods, that means that they're going to increase in both the consumption of overnight stays and concert tickets, right? So they're actually going to go to this point right here, which is point N. And this is a point where we've got 5 overnight stays and 20 tickets that are consumed, right? So we're increasing in our stays and we're also increasing in our tickets, right? So when both of those goods are normal goods, we go to this point N, where both of them are increasing. Because for the most part, if you have more money, are you going to take more or less overnight stays or more or less concert tickets, right? They're pretty much they're a normal good. Now, what if overnight stays was an inferior good? If overnight stays is an inferior good, then as your income increases, are you going to do less of them or more of them? Less of them. Very good. As an inferior good, they'll do less. So this will be somewhere up here, choice P, which is 232, right? This is if stays are inferior. This is where both are normal. And now, what if tickets were an inferior good, right? So now we have to do this up, down, this way, right? If tickets are an inferior good and our income increases, are we going to consume more tickets or less tickets? Less. Very good. So we're going to be down here. at point Q. So this is where tickets are inferior. And questions on the income increasing and how the impact on consumption depends on the relationship we have with that good. Is it a normal good or an inferior good? Okay. What about if the price of something changes? So this is baseball bats become more expensive. So we've got a two-good world between baseball bats and cameras, right? Two consumer goods. We've got some sort of initial consumption situation. Actually, I'm going to draw it over here. Just again, I'm trying to keep consistent with the book for you. So we've got an initial curve here where we've got this point M. So this is our original utility maximizing choice. And then if baseball bats become more expensive, do we think we're going to be able to, if we went all out on no cameras, I guess cameras is kind of an antiquated thing since we all have phones. Who buys a camera anymore, right? Yeah, it's, again, I mean, yeah, all of that. But so for the most part, but yeah, exactly. SLRs are great. So if you went all in on baseball bats, and so this is your all in on baseball bats point, right? If they became more expensive, would I be able to get more baseball bats or less? Less. Very good. So instead of this point here, I'm somewhere like this point, right? But is this impacting my ability to get cameras at all? No. The price of cameras hasn't changed. My income hasn't changed. So this is going to be what we call a, what do they call it? Rotation inwards, right? Because it's like a clock going around. So this is a rotation inwards due to higher prices. And what we can do is we can go ahead and draw a dashed line here. And that'll tell us, in a way, if our new point is somewhere in here, what does that tell us about cameras and baseball bats? So it doesn't really tell us anything. Trick question. So unlike the other one, right? This just says they're going to. So if they go from point this to point this, then essentially what's happening is just the income effect, which we'll talk about in a second here. But let's say they went to some point over here. If they went to some point H, right? The higher price of baseball bats made them decrease the amount of baseball bats and increase the amount of cameras that they have, right? So this one is showing some of the substitution effect. That at higher prices, you're going to be able to consume less of anything, so that's the income effect. But at higher prices, you're going to substitute away from the thing that's the higher price. So almost through. Our response to higher prices. So typically, how do we respond to higher prices? We consume less of the product with the higher price, right? Why do we do this? So the first is the substitution effect. The consumers have an incentive to consume less and to change their consumption patterns. This happens always at the same time as the substitution effect, or sorry, the income effect. Jeez. Come on, Chris. So the income effect means that is talking about how higher prices mean less actual what's called purchasing power. You are less able to purchase as much as you did before, right? Instead of getting 10 baseball bats, now you can only buy 9 baseball bats. Even though, so less purchasing power. So essentially, this is talking about the buying power or ability of your income. And so this is reduced despite the fact that in these particular problems, the actual income hasn't changed. So I know it's kind of confusing. The income effect is a situation where literally the income has not changed. The nominal income, the amount of money that people are taking home, does not change at all. Questions on income substitution effects? Again, you just need to know what they are. All right. Last bit of, so we're going to skip the foundations of demand curve, so don't worry about that. And now we'll talk about one of my favorite subjects, behavioral economics. So traditional economics assumes that everybody behaves rationally, right? That everybody takes all this information and they're consistent and informed with their decisions. It assumes that, humans have complete self-control. However, behavioral economists have found that, people actually don't always make consistent, informed decisions that are in their best interest. And so behavioral economics takes into account people's state of mind. So looking more into the how psychology interacts with economics. So again, this section of the book, 6.3, it's definitely worth a read. It talks about how, we have this notion of fungibility. Fungible means that the units of a good are capable of mutual substitution for each other and carry equal value. And so the book talks about how, if you work 3 hours to make $30, you usually spend that $30 differently than if you were to just find $30 on the street, right? Despite the fact that the $30 that you found on the street is exactly the same as the $30 that you earned by working. But you might spend it as, some extra money, right? Some mad money is what the book talks about. The book also talks about how, people will sometimes have savings account balances of, $3,000, but then also carry credit card balances, so the savings account is they could pay off the credit card balance, right? That's, 15% a month or whatever the case may be. So they're paying $110 every year in order to, so they're paying $110 a year that they don't have to. So traditional economics would be like, well, that's impossible. It could never happen. And behavioral economics steps in and says, well, again, the person's state of mind, right? Maybe having no savings creates this, financial insecurity or whatever in them, right? Yeah.
So I was reading an article and it said like 64% of like the U.S. population, people that are making like 100K a year and down, are struggling to pay their bills too.
Yeah. Yeah, for that's been like for the last 10, 15 years. And that it's surveyed, and like more than half of the people surveyed say that if they had like a $500,000 bill, like they would have to like get their friends and family to help them pay it or whatever. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's and so part of what behavioral economics tries to do, and what they have done is, so when you sign up for a job and you're 20 or something like that, or even in your 30s, right? There's all these different choices to make. It's so complicated. You're just kind of like exhausted by all the decisions. So a lot of times you don't really look into the retirement plan or whatever the case, right? So people the plans used to be what's called opt-in, and they switched it as a result of behavioral economics to make it opt-out. And as a result, just from that one little switch, the amount of people that are saving earlier and paying into retirement programs earlier has increased dramatically. So what I'll do to help you guys with this section is I'm going to send you a podcast and a video that's about behavioral economics. We did cover all of the stuff that we needed to cover for chapter